would like to be able to say it's good to see you all, but that is not my privilege today. But I can give a welcome to all those watching online, and I look forward to the time when we'll be able to meet in person again. The author Jean Brown is quoted as saying, "The really tough thing about humility is that you can't brag about it." With this in mind, please turn with me to Numbers chapter 12. In Numbers chapter 12 and verse 3, we read, "Now the man Moses was very humble, more so than anyone else on the face of the earth." So who wrote this? Is Moses boasting about his own humility? If our view is to assume that Moses himself wrote every word in the Pentateuch, then this statement would certainly suggest a lack of modesty and lead us to question his humility. It's most likely that this comment was added by a later editor. But let's go back and consider the context of this statement. In verses 1 and 2, we read, "Miriam and Aaron spoke against Moses because of the Cushite woman whom he had married. And they said, 'Has the Lord spoken only through Moses? Has he not spoken through us also?'" Why is Miriam's name mentioned first? There is evidence that she was the spokesperson and leader, and Aaron the follower. The verb spoke is in the feminine form, and she said, which supports this view. Now it's unlikely that Zipporah was the subject of Miriam's displeasure, because Moses had married her many years before, and this wouldn't have prompted her current reaction. It's more likely that Zipporah had died, and that her concerns were voiced following his recent second marriage, which didn't meet her approval. In Eastern culture, to a greater degree than here in the West, when you get married, your family is closely linked to your partner's family. And parents are concerned not only with your marriage partner, but with their family too. Miriam was deeply critical of Moses because, in her view, he had exercised a serious lack of judgment in marrying this Cushite or Ethiopian woman. There are some strong racial undertones here, which suggest that Miriam viewed this dark-skinned woman as coming from an inferior social class. She was not an Israelite, and possibly ranked even lower than an Egyptian foreigner on Miriam's cultural scale. Miriam felt that Moses had lowered the status of her family in the eyes of the Israelite community, that he'd shown insensitivity to her feelings, and put her in a very uncomfortable position. And it was this that led her to question his leadership. Miriam is described as a prophetess in Exodus 15:2. And Aaron was also used as God's spokesman. Miriam reasoned that because God had used them in a prophetic role, that all three family members were equally qualified for the leadership position. And it would be better if the leadership responsibilities were shared. Miriam's comments seem to imply that given the current circumstances, their insights as the older brother and sister were needed. Their collective judgment could be used, if necessary, to overrule Moses and prevent him from making more unwise decisions in the future. So, placed in the position of Moses, how would you have reacted to Miriam and Aaron? They were challenging both his wisdom and leadership. Moses kept his patience under extreme provocation and kept quiet. He didn't defend his own judgment or his own leadership. This is what is described here as meekness or humility. But we read in verse 2 that the Lord heard it, and God deemed it necessary to intervene. He acted to defend Moses from these accusations, which were motivated by Miriam's own prejudice and wrong attitudes. Moses wasn't always meek. It was a quality he had to learn. Moses received the best education that Egypt had to offer, but patience and meekness were not in the program of study. At the end of his first phase of education, Moses thought that he was prepared for leadership, and he began to work for God using his own strategy. He was impulsive, and when he saw an Egyptian beating one of the Israelites, he got angry and killed him. He hoped to get support from the Israelites, but what happened was the exact opposite. Forced to flee from Egypt, he now started his second phase of education, in the solitude of the mountains with just sheep for company. Moses learned to be still and know that I am God. Psalm 46 verse 10. I have found that the lockdown, bad as it is, has some aspects that have been a blessing to me. Normally I have a fairly busy lifestyle, but now I've been forced to adopt a different routine. It's given me opportunity to reassess my priorities, to spend a bit more time in reflection, and to build my relationship with God. And in times of helplessness and weakness, we're more likely to trust God and less likely to suffer from pride or self-glory. Charles Coulson rapidly rose to power and worked as advisor for President Richard Nixon. Some of us old enough to remember the 70s may remember him. In his book titled Loving God, Coulson writes that his influence grew not from his success, but from his failure. He was implicated in the Watergate scandal and sent to prison. He writes, "The real legacy of my life was my biggest failure, that I was an ex-convict. My greatest humiliation, being sent to prison, was the beginning of God's greatest use of my life." Coulson became a Christian and founded Prison Fellowship, which helps around 365,000 inmates to experience healing and reduces reoffending. He says, God chose the one experience in which I could not glory, for his glory. The failure of Moses brought an abrupt end to his life of luxury in Egypt and led to his stay in Midian. It's unlikely that Moses would have chosen work as a shepherd if other options had been available. Pharaoh's court despised shepherds, Genesis 46:34. And Moses was not educated for nomadic life. He had to learn a completely different skill set and also had to swallow his pride to work as Jethro's assistant. Sheep are not the most adorable of animals except at a distance or in pictures. They're not the most intelligent. They're slow to learn, stubborn, unpredictable, and apt to stray. They follow one another, and they are restless creatures. Because of pests, parasites, and fear of predators or hunger, they sleep very little. You seldom find a sheep lying down. But what they do well is consume lots of grass and clover. Each one needs 8 to 10 square meters of grazing space each day. Your job as sheep minder is to provide security from danger and places with enough food to sustain them. Every day requires a similar routine. Moses saw no career prospects, but God saw that this was a job where he could learn the essential qualities needed to lead people. In the wilderness with sheep for company, Moses developed patience and humility. Probably having Zipporah as his wife helped him too. As Moses reflected on the history of his people, under God's direction he wrote the book of Genesis, including the life histories of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and eventually his own autobiography. He recorded important doctrines, such as the creation of man in the image of God, the Sabbath, the fall, and the promise of a Redeemer. I believe that doctrines are important as they shape our worldview and underpin our attitudes and values, helping us to build a right relationship with God and with others. But we don't honor God or build relationships by presenting the truth with a bad attitude, something I've been guilty of doing on numerous occasions. I've had discussions with Jehovah's Witnesses on the Trinity and left feeling good that I'd won the argument. I was doing God's work. I've discussed many issues with church members, but too often my underlying attitude in seeking to straighten out my opponents has been quite different from the attitude that Christ represented. Blessed are the poor in spirit, the meek, the peacemakers, etc. In nature, and with nature's God, the character of Moses changed. he learned God's attitudes, and not to depend on human power, human wisdom, and human strategies, but on God's power alone. His life experience as a shepherd teaches us that waiting time doesn't need to be wasted time. I would like to develop more humility, but I'm not thrilled with God's methods. I find what is termed the prosperity gospel more appealing than hardship. I can only trust that God, who sees the future, knows what he's doing, and that the gain far exceeds the pain. God promises to teach us if we're willing to be educated by him. Matthew 11:28 and 29 is my favorite Bible text. Christ says, "Take my yoke and learn of me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your soul." The hymn writer Fanny Crosby, who became blind shortly after birth, understood something about this when she wrote, "Perfect submission, all is at rest. I, in my Saviour, am happy and blessed. Watching and waiting, looking above, filled with his goodness, lost in his love." She was not describing an idyllic life, free from problems. Her own life was tough, but also a great blessing to others. Christ was a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief, and his life was one of submission to his Father. He prayed, "Not my will, but thy will be done." Christ didn't learn humility for his own benefit. He learned it to fulfill the mission he was given, to save you and me. And God didn't teach Moses humility just for his own benefit. He had a mission for his life. When the time was right, Moses didn't have to promote his own leadership credentials. God revealed himself to him, told him what he wanted him to do, and promised, "I'll be with you." When Moses protested that he was not a good speaker, God told him, "I'll be with your mouth and teach you what you are to speak." And despite this, he begged God to send somebody else. Exodus 4:13. I note that God doesn't commend Moses for his humility in this situation. When God calls us to do something, humility means being willing to go forward, recognizing our own weakness, but depending on God's power. A false humility is based on fear of failure and really shows distrust in God. And I can identify with that. Thankfully, Moses did respond to God's call and entered the final phase of his life as leader of God's people. Consider the qualities he now possessed. Exodus 14:13. Moses says, "Don't be afraid. Stand still and see the salvation of the Lord." He demonstrates wisdom and humility when he listens to Jethro and accepts his advice, when he tells him he needs to delegate more. Exodus 18:24. President Lincoln once got caught up in a situation where he wanted to please a politician. So he issued a command to move some of his regiments to a different location. When his Secretary of War, Edwin Stanton, received the order, he refused to carry it out. He said the president was a fool. Lincoln was told what Stanton had said, and he replied, "If Stanton says I'm a fool, then I must be, for he is nearly always right. I'll see for myself." As the two men talked, the president realized that his decision was a serious mistake and withdrew it. I would like to learn humility, and I'm inspired by the life of Moses. Moses gave up his life of luxury to help his people, who didn't really appreciate the sacrifice he'd made. 40 years in Egypt, watching his people suffer, 40 years feeding sheep and writing Genesis, and 40 years leading an ungrateful people who blamed him for all of their problems. Even his own brother and sister felt that they could do a better job. After the incident, when Miriam and Aaron challenged his leadership, and God punished Miriam with leprosy, Moses pleads for God to heal her. Numbers 12:13. There is no sense of bitterness. His life inspires us to love and to serve God's people, even when their actions and attitudes disappoint us, or when we in turn frustrate them or fail to meet their expectations. God can teach us to love people who are at times unlikable, in the same way that Christ loves me and you. The attitude of Moses meets the criteria of Matthew 5:5. Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. At the end of the book of Deuteronomy, there's an account of the death of Moses and his burial. Now, Moses probably didn't write that himself. The author writes, "Never since has there risen a prophet in Israel whom the Lord knew face to face." In Numbers 12:7 and 8, where God is addressing Miriam and Aaron, God himself calls Moses his trusted servant, with whom he speaks face to face. May we, as God's servants, who are privileged to come into his presence through Jesus Christ, be willing to learn humility.